start with just some very broad motivation before I turn to the specific studies. So I think if you look across the half century across the world, there's been a very significant democratization of low-income countries. And indeed, if today you look at a lot of policy recommendations coming out from bodies such as the UN, World Bank, and so on, there's a lot of emphasis that democratization is an important policy prescription. So just to, at the same time, I think there's also growing cynicism in a lot of ways that maybe democracy in itself isn't enough. And many people, in fact, quote India as a common example, that India was one of the first democracies in the low-income world, and 55 years later, we still see a lot of problems with service delivery. So I think, in some sense, I would argue that the question has moved much more to how do we strengthen democratic institutions rather than count whether or not a country has a democracy simply in terms of whether it has elections. And the work that we have been doing has been very motivated by this idea that in many countries now, and certainly in India, you can luckily take the fact that there will be elections and that there will be democratically elected governments for granted. But the question then is, what more can we do in order to strengthen how a democracy is able to give the poor voice in the policy process? If you look at turnout figures for India, they've been extremely stable over the last half century. So roughly, if you look across most elections, turnout averages across 60 to 65%, and there's been no significant trend in this. On the other hand, there have been some trends that are more concerning. First, in a number of states, you see a rise of ethnic politics or caste politics, where there is a demand that voters should vote not on the basis of who is performing well or who is providing development, but simply if they are of your biradri, if they are your group, you should vote for them. The second thing is, and this has been made more salient by the fact that now candidates have to file affidavits, and perhaps some of this was going on earlier as well, but there is significant attention paid to the fact that when we look at the affidavits filed by politicians, in a lot of states you see a very high number of legislators who are standing with criminal charges. And while many of these charges may be politically motivated, a number of them are extremely serious. So if you look at just in the national elections, the number of national legislators with a criminal record, or criminal charges I should correctly, increased from 128 to 150, as did the number with so-called heinous charges. And I think the larger concern is, why is the state continuing to not provide what the poor would like to have? I think we've had a lot of discussion of education and health, and what is the larger governance issues that may be constraining such delivery? So what I want to talk about today is really briefly results from two interventions, and then I'm very happy to be able to hand it over to Anjali, who will talk from a practitioner's perspective about how on the ground they're trying to affect change through information. So the first study I want to talk about is one we conducted in UP in the run-up to the 2007 state election. We worked in 3 districts, Sitapur, Baharaich, and Lalitpur. These are districts that have typically seen relatively high levels of caste-based voting. And we wanted to ask whether you can persuade voters. So we don't give them information. All our campaigns are always explicitly non-partisan. These were not campaigns where we were saying vote for candidate X or candidate Y. We were simply giving them very general messages on what perhaps is a good basis for voting. So in the UP campaign, we analyzed 2 different interventions. The first one, in some sense, you might think of an indirect development campaign. So the message there was through, I'll show through posters, through meetings, and through nataks in the evening, was don't vote on caste, vote for development. And then the direct campaign, which we saw also in a subset of areas, was to vote for clean candidates. So if you just look at I hope this works, if you look at the areas where we were working, these were the constituencies in which we were working, and this simply notes for each district that we were working. So out of the 4 major candidates, as you can see in Baharaich, 3 had criminal charges against them. Roughly half of them had no candidates with criminal charges and half of them had criminal charges. So in the treatment village, a local NGO team would spend a day, and this was the nature of the caste campaign. These are all obviously in Hindi, but this is a rough translation. Caste campaign, the main message which was repeated again was the development issues affect everyone in the village, not just one caste. Vote for development not on caste lines. And the corruption campaign said vote for clean politicians that care about your development needs. So the emphasis really was that development should be what you should be thinking about in voting. Here's an example of the kind of excuse me, posters that were used. So the campaign used, as I said, posters, meetings, and it used puppet shows. This is actually an area where the tradition of natak and puppet show. So that was a very typical means of using it. Excuse me. I had a film, but unfortunately we haven't been able to load it, so I can't show you that. And this is what a corruption campaign poster looked like. We did face some resistance in implementing the campaign, but overall it was successful, and the district administration was actually very cooperative with us in all the places. Excuse me. So I think the first outcome we find is that voters can be motivated. So when we look at simply the results on turnout, and the way we look at the results is that our campaign was randomized at the polling station level. So we simply compare villages where we had the campaign versus places where we didn't. And you find a significant rise in voting. This is actually pronounced for men. So we had less of an effect on women, but we had a strong effect on men. And this effect was particularly strong in those constituencies where at least one of the candidates standing had criminal charges. Those were the places where voters seemed to get particularly motivated and come out and to vote. So in areas with a heinous crime charge, male turnout went up from 64% to 74%. We also find that the basis of voting can be influenced. So what this graph shows you is the fraction of voters, and this is from, because data is anonymized in the electoral data, the way we measured whether there was caste voting was to work with one of the exit poll companies, so Yogendra Yadav CSDS, and collect this data. And we find that caste voting went down by 5% according to the survey data. And if the caste preferred candidate, and this is particularly important, if the caste preferred candidate had a heinous crime charge, then actually the decline was even larger. So you can see that in this sense, an indirect campaign on caste can actually have implications for at least one measure of quality, which is criminality. On the other hand, the corruption campaign, which was the campaign that said vote for clean candidates, had no effect. And in the end, our sense was that this was an environment where villagers were very cynical. If you talk to them, they'll say, there is corruption everywhere, everyone is making money. So when you go and you give them just this very generalized message that don't vote for corruption, they don't know how to evaluate it, or they feel it's tautological, that there isn't much substance in what you're saying. And for that reason, we moved on to the next stage, where we were very lucky to meet Anjali and her group, who were already working in this area. So in Delhi, Anjali will talk much more about this, SNS has a tradition of using RTIs to get information on legislator performance. As you know, affidavits on candidates are already available, but they use RTIs to also get information on performance. So we conducted a campaign. This was in the slums in 10 constituencies in Delhi. So in each constituency, we worked with NGOs, we worked with the Delhi NGO network, which drew up the entire slum mapping for the constituency. And then within the slum mapping, we randomly selected 200 polling stations for treatment. So in the first phase, there was a voter education module where they were informed about the rights and responsibilities of the legislators and also how to vote. In the Delhi election this time, you could identify yourself as a voter using up to 28 different ID cards. And this was important information, especially to give slum dwellers who often, because they don't have rights of a house, are often missed out in many voter registration campaigns. The second phase was we used report cards. These were published in Dainik Hindustan. Dainik Hindustan actually published report cards with SNS for all 70 constituencies. It was only 10 that we evaluated. The way we did our treatment was that in areas that were on our treatment, each slum dweller was given a free copy of the newspaper. So people who were not in the control areas could also be reading the newspaper. We just ensured that our group got it at a high rate. And in the third phase, the NGOs did some community discussions based on this. So this is just an example of one Delhi slum, and this is a door-to-door campaign going on. As you can see, the door is not very obvious. This is a report card. I think a translation of the report card is actually in the brief that's provided. And basically, the first part of it describes for the legislator information along three criteria: how often they attended the legislature and whether they asked starred and unstarred questions. The second is how they spent the MLA development fund spending. And then the last was on committees. So in Delhi, the two most important committees that legislators sit on are the Ration Committee and the Police Vigilance Committee. These are both committees that are very relevant for slum dwellers. And then below that, we provided information from the affidavits on all the three candidates who were standing for election from the three main parties. So that was Congress, BJP, and BSP. We used electoral data to evaluate this campaign. So the first effect we found, which I think parallels UP, is that turnout, it's not that the 40% who are not voting can never be made to vote. We find in the slum areas, the campaign increased turnout from 56 to 60%. So you find a significant increase in turnout. The second thing we did was we conducted between the election being completed and the results coming out, we collected data on slum dwellers on what they cared about. And I think this is again the kind of sense in which information is not just a bad thing for people standing for election. I think there's a lot of perception that information should be not provided because it will always harm politicians. As I'll show, one of the things that this information helped us do is really understand how voters are seeking not to blindly punish all incumbents, but to try to also decide who's done a good job. So this is just data showing you what did voters care about. So when we asked voters, what was the most important thing when you voted? The two things that mattered the lot were local development and price rise. So in 2009, early 2009, oil prices had gone up. Delhi had had very high price increases for food. In very poor areas, this was seen as an important issue. And in fact, both parties were campaigning on both sides. So BJP in Delhi was campaigning purely on the price rise issue. They were the challenger party, and they wanted to use price rise. And Congress was campaigning on development. So there was clear use of these two criteria by the two parties. What you see when we look across our 10 constituencies, we find significant difference. So if you look in the poorer constituencies, for instance, Seelampur, people care a lot more about price rise and less about development. On the other hand, if you look at Vishwasnagar, 93% of the people said they care about local development, and 60% said they cared about a price rise. So I think sort of understanding areas and issues will be very different, and that obviously means we would expect variation in how people would behave. So what we found is, first we found significant evidence, and even though these numbers look small, I can assure you they're very significant and they can make the difference in as closely contested elections like in Delhi between winning and losing. So if you look at across the board, the good news is voters were able to tell something. So even without our treatment, the incumbents who had formed and attended ration committees did better across the board. That's true. Out of our 10 constituencies, in 5 the incumbents had done so. However, in the treatment areas, there was an extra bump. So you did benefit from information in those areas. And this effect was even larger in those constituencies where price rise was the most important issue. So you see in those areas, good performance got rewarded. Then we turn to spending on MLA Lads Fund. And I think the most striking way, in some sense, to look at perhaps a not full performance is how much you choose not to spend. So I think there's a lot of variation in this. Anjali was telling me when they did this in Jharkhand recently, people are spending all the money. In Delhi, 30 to 40% of the MLA LAD's allocation is unspent at the end of 5 years. So you can roll it over from year to year, but it still gets unspent. So if you look at this spending, most of the spending happens on roads. So the most important is roads, then drains and parks, and then community halls. But by far, people are spending on roads. But then when you look at where the spending occurs, you actually find most of the roads are not occurring in the slums. They're occurring in other places. So what we did is actually after the report cards, we coded line by line, because we get line items, where the spending had occurred, whether it occurred in a slum or a non-slum. Remember, our intervention was in slums. And then what we find that basically people who had spent in slums, so the kind of thing that gets spent in a slum is to build a barat ghar, for instance. For slum dwellers, a barat ghar is very important. That's the place, they have very poor housing, that's the kind of place where they can have their weddings of their children, they can have community functions. Sewage matters, drainage matters, but parks don't matter, decorative lights don't matter. And then what you find in those areas that there is significantly more spending in, significantly more votes for those candidates who spent more in slums. So if you simply look at the first bar, and since I'm short of time, that's one I'll talk about. If you spent more in slums, for every 1 lakh extra spent in slums, your vote share went up by 2.4%. So let me conclude and hand over to Anjali. I think what we take away from this really is that there's an important accountability tool available to voters, that is to vote. And people often doubt whether this will be used for development. There's a lot of cynicism that in low-income countries there will be vote buying, voters don't care about it. What we find is that is not true. There seems to be genuine interest in understanding what your elected official is doing and using the information. And I would argue that in a lot of cases, voting is very powerful because it's in some sense easier to do. It's easier to just go once and vote than to, say, form a parent-teacher committee. You can form a parent-teacher committee, but you don't know how to use it. And so I think, at least from the civic society perspective, thinking of how to empower voters may be an extremely important tool. And from politicians' perspective, recognizing that information is not always a bad thing, that actually if you have a development record to be proud of, advertising it is electorally a powerful tool is also relevant. But let me hand over to Anjali at this point.